Imagine a morning, early, the kind of morning where mist still clings to the river. A city is waking up, and everyone in it, every baker, every bricklayer, every merchant standing at his stall, speaks the same words. Not the same kind of words, the same words, exactly. One tongue, one speech, one sound for bread, one sound for river, one sound for home. Now imagine that by midday, something has changed. The baker calls out to his neighbor. His neighbor turns, blinks, and does not understand a single syllable, not one. It isn't that the words have been forgotten. It's as if they were never shared to begin with. As if two men who grew up in the same house are suddenly foreigners to each other. This is the moment the ancient text describes. Not a war, not a plague, not a slow forgetting. A fracture. Sudden, total, bewildering. Tonight, we are going to follow that story. First through the ancient words themselves, as a living scene, not a lecture. Then through the world that surrounded it, the towers, the cities, the empires. Then through the echoes, because other ancient traditions, older than the Bible, whisper something remarkably similar. And finally, through the most unsettling possibility of all. What if both versions of this story are true? What if the myth and the history are describing the same thing, just from different angles? A language is a border you carry in your mouth, and tonight we're going to find out when that border was first drawn. The ancient account begins with a plain. Not a mountain, not a coastline, a flat, wide, hot plain. The text calls it Shinar, and into that plain a people came. The text says they had one language, one set of words, all of them, no walls between their meaning and their mouths. They understood one another completely, and this, the ancient story implies, was both a gift and a danger. Because when you can coordinate perfectly, when every person hears the same word and pictures the same thing, you can build. And this people decided to build, not a house, not a temple, a tower. The text describes their ambition in one extraordinary line, a tower, the tradition says, whose top would reach the heavens. Now, stop there for a moment, because modern readers often picture a cartoon tower, something absurd, a ladder poking into clouds. But the people who first told this story didn't mean something naive. They meant something that was actually being built around them. We'll come back to that. The text says they used brick instead of stone, and bitumen, a dark, sticky tar, instead of mortar. This is not a small detail. Stone was what you used in the hills, in the west, in Canaan. Brick and bitumen, that was the Mesopotamian way. That was the way of the great river cities, the way of the people who lived between the Tigris and the Euphrates. The storyteller knew exactly what kind of building this was. And the tradition adds a motive that is quiet but revealing. They wanted a name. Not fame as vanity, a name as anchor. Because in a flat world, people fear being scattered. A city is a knot. A tower is a pin driven into the earth saying, "Here." Imagine the work. Kilns breathing heat, rows of fresh bricks drying under sun, hands blackened with bitumen, ropes creaking, a foreman calling one word, and 100 bodies moving as one. Perfect coordination. That is the real power the text is pointing at, not the height, the unity. And listen, this is where the tension tightens. If human beings can organize like that, what else can they organize? Walls, armies, empires, or something colder, the belief that nothing is beyond human reach. So the tower rises, level after level, not a needle into clouds, a terraced stairway, massive, practical, terrifyingly achievable. And somewhere in the market below, children repeat the same phrases their parents repeat, the same jokes, the same curses, the same prayers. One sound across thousands of mouths. Then, without warning, the sounds begin to slip. Not everyone at once. A pause, a misheard word, a laugh that dies in the throat. A worker holds a brick and waits for the next instruction, and the instruction arrives like noise. What would you do in that moment? If your world depended on understanding, if your safety lived inside shared words. And then, the account says, the divine sees it, and the divine comes down to look, which is itself a fascinating image. This tower built to reach the heavens, and the heavens still have to descend to find it. The text records the reasoning. If they have one language and have begun to do this, nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Let that sentence sit. The ancient tradition is not saying these people are wicked. It isn't calling them evil. It is saying they are too unified, too capable. A species with one voice and one will is a species without natural limits. And so, the text says, the language is confounded. The Genesis account uses that word specifically in chapter 11, verse 7. Confound, scatter. And the city, the tower, is left unfinished, called Babel, because the sound of it, in the original Hebrew, echoes the word for confusion. Balal, to mix, to scramble, to pour together until nothing is separate anymore. And yet, in Babylon's own tongue, the name carried a different meaning. Bab Ilu, Gate of God. One city, two etymologies. Already the story contains two languages arguing over one sound. Now, if you heard that story for the first time tonight, and you didn't know it was ancient, you might think, that sounds like a myth invented to explain something real. And you would be asking exactly the right question. Because here's what's strange. Here is what keeps historians and linguists and archaeologists up at night. In the very region this story describes, in Mesopotamia, in Shinar, there really were towers, real ones, built from brick and bitumen, reaching toward the sky, and they were everywhere. A language is a border you carry in your mouth, and in Shinar, that border was about to be shattered. To understand the Tower of Babel, you have to understand the land it came from, because Mesopotamia was not like anywhere else on Earth. Not then. Picture two great rivers, the Tigris in the east, the Euphrates in the west. Between them, an alluvial plain so flat and so rich with river silt that almost anything would grow there. No mountains, no natural stone, just flat, dark, incredible earth. And from that earth, they made bricks. Thousands of them, millions of them eventually. A brick is a small thing, but stack enough of them, and you can manufacture a horizon. In Babylon, many bricks were stamped with names. Kings pressed identity into clay. ownership made physical. And every stamped title was also a sound, a syllable carried by thousands of mouths. Listen to a building site long enough, and you hear the same thing. A command shouted, a command repeated, a command answered. That is how a city becomes one body. And that is why the Babel story is frightening. It threatens the one thing empires cannot survive without: shared instructions. If the command breaks, the wall breaks. If the wall breaks, the empire breaks. So ask yourself, was the tower the symbol or the infrastructure beneath it? Sun-dried first, then kiln-fired, and from those bricks they built upward, not because they had to, because they chose to. The ancient people of Mesopotamia believed that the gods lived in high places. Mountains were sacred. But in Mesopotamia, there were no mountains, so they built artificial ones. They called them ziggurats, step towers, each level smaller than the one below, rising in terraces like a staircase cut from the sky. One of the most famous and best preserved ziggurats still rises in the city of 3 massive stages of sun-baked brick, dedicated to the moon god Nana, built to be the physical point where heaven and earth connected, a meeting place between the human world and the divine one. But here is the detail that changes everything. And in Babylon itself, there was a ziggurat so monumental it dominated the skyline. Was called, in the ancient Babylonian language, Etemenanki, which means house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Not a watchtower, not a castle, a cosmic statement, a mountain made of brick, built where there were no mountains. A way of saying, heaven has an address, and we know it. Now imagine the city around it. Babylon was not a silent place. It was markets and ovens, metalwork, river traffic, contracts, arguments, and languages. Because great trade cities attract tongues the way lanterns attract moths, a merchant from the north arrives with a different accent. A soldier from a border garrison brings a different slang. A scribe hears a word and writes it the way his ear understands it. And suddenly, the official record contains a new spelling. And that matters, because once a word is written on clay, it hardens, it becomes law, it becomes tax, it becomes ownership. So ask yourself, was Babel only a tower? Or was it also the first time human beings realized that speech can be managed and therefore controlled? Let that name settle. House of the foundation of heaven and earth, a structure whose name literally described it as the place where sky and ground were joined. A tower that, in its builders' minds, did reach the heavens, not metaphorically, architecturally. Some scholars believe that this specific structure, Etemenanki in Babylon, may be the direct inspiration for the Babel account, or one of several inspirations, because there were ziggurats in Nippur, in in Uruk, in Eridu, one of the oldest cities ever found. This was not a single building. This was an entire theology expressed in brick. Now, what happened to Etemenanki? This is where the story gets even stranger. We know from ancient records that this tower was, at various points, partially destroyed, left unfinished, rebuilt, left unfinished again. The great Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II wrote about plans to finish its reconstruction. And then, it fell into ruin. An enormous, ambitious tower, begun, abandoned, begun again, never quite complete. in the very city whose name echoes the word for confusion. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later and preserved through translation, describes Babylon as a city with a great, multi-tiered tower at its center. He speaks of stages, of height, of a sanctuary at the top. Some readers hear, in his description, the feeling of something unfinished, not as proof, but as atmosphere, as if the builders had simply stopped. We don't know if Herodotus was describing Etemenanki specifically, but the image holds: a great tower, rising toward sky, left, in some sense, incomplete. Now, if the ziggurat was the stage, what was the drama being played out on it? Who were the people building these towers, and what were they actually trying to accomplish? Here's the part that most retellings of Babel skip completely. The ancient Mesopotamian cities were not homogeneous. Even in their earliest periods, they were meeting points. Sumerians, Akkadians, Amorites, Elamites, Kassites, different peoples flowing in and out of the great river cities. Different ways of speaking, different names for their gods. The ziggurat wasn't just built by one people. It was built by a civilization that was, from the very beginning, multilingual. Which raises the question the ancient text may actually be wrestling with. Not, how did languages split, but what happens to a civilization built on many voices when those voices can no longer agree? A language is a border you carry in your mouth, and in Babylon, that border was already there, long before the tower was finished. What happens next in the ancient record will surprise you, because the Bible is not the only ancient source that speaks of speech being altered. There is an older text, much older, and it says something that should not be possible. We need to talk about a text that most people have never heard of. A text far older than the Genesis account as we have it, written in a language that was already ancient when the pyramids were new. It is called the Epic of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, and it comes from ancient Sumer. Picture it for a moment, not as literature, but as a living memory. A clay tablet pressed into being by a scribe who could feel the heat of the day through the wall. A story that began in a world where writing itself was still new enough to feel like sorcery. Because think about what cuneiform is: a sound, turned into a wedge, pressed into clay, then baked, so that a voice could outlast a mouth. When a culture discovers that, it starts to treat speech differently. Words become more than air. Words become architecture. Now, let's be careful here. Scholars debate what this text means. The translation is difficult. The interpretation is contested. There is no scholarly consensus on whether this is a parallel to Babel or simply a similar theme arriving independently. That is the honest position, and we hold it. But here is what the text describes. Enmerkar was a king of Uruk, one of the great ancient Sumerian cities. The text describes a time, distant even then, when all the lands of the known world spoke a single language to the god Enlil. The text describes a time, distant even then, when all the lands of the known world spoke a single language to the god Enlil. And then the poem does something subtle. It turns one tongue into a kind of dream, a political dream, a religious dream, a dream of control. Because Enmerkar is not only a king in this story, he is a king who wants things to be understood. He wants words to land the same way in every ear. He wants a message to travel without changing shape. And now picture the opposite. Picture a messenger leaving Uruk, dust on his sandals, a sealed tablet in his satchel. He walks for days. He climbs into hills. He reaches a city that speaks differently, and the first word that leaves his mouth fails. He tries again. The guard hears something else. The guard answers with a word that sounds like a door closing. In that moment, speech is not a bridge. Speech is a wall. So when an ancient text imagines one tongue, it may be imagining the end of that wall, the return of effortless passage. And when it imagines that unity being changed, it is describing a fracture that feels cosmic, not because vowels shifted, but because meaning stopped traveling cleanly. What breaks first when languages break? Trade? Peace? Love? One tongue, one worship, one speech for all the scattered peoples. And then, the tradition describes, that unity was changed. The text uses language that some scholars read as, the speech of mankind was made to be diverse. Or, in another reading, confused. The single voice became many voices, and the unity of worship, the single tongue raised to the heavens, was fractured. Now, is this the same story as Babel? We don't know. We genuinely don't. But consider the geography. The Epic of Enmerkar was written in Sumer, the very region the Bible calls Shinar. The same flat plain, the same river-fed cities, the same brick and bitumen civilization. Two completely different textual traditions, one Sumerian, one Hebrew, both from the same geographic heartland, both describing a time when language was unified and then, somehow, diversified. Both describing a time when language was unified and then, somehow, diversified. And here is a tension worth holding, because the ancient Near East, as far as we can tell, was already multilingual in many places. City-states traded, empires rose and absorbed neighbors, scribes learned multiple scripts. So why would a tradition remember one language? Sometimes a myth uses one to mean one official speech, one shared ritual tongue, one standard that held a world together until it didn't. Picture a temple school. A student recites sacred lines in an old language used for the gods. Then he walks home and speaks another language at the dinner fire. Two tongues in one mouth, already. So the Babel moment may be less about the first time humans heard a foreign language, and more about the first time unity itself stopped working, the first time the shared code fractured. And that is why it is told like lightning, because collapse feels sudden, even when the pressure built for years. Is Babel describing a miracle, or a memory of systems failing, so violently that it felt supernatural? Now, there are scholars who believe the Enmerkar text came first, and that the Babel story in Genesis is, in some sense, a response to it, a retelling, a reinterpretation by a different people with a different theology. Same landscape, same cultural memory, different meaning given to the fracture. Others argue this is a coincidence. that stories about language confusion arise independently across cultures because the experience of encountering a foreign tongue, someone you cannot understand, is one of the most disorienting experiences a human being can have. Of course, people built myths around it. Of course. But here is the thing that neither explanation fully resolves. Both traditions, the Sumerian and the Hebrew, treat this moment as a before and after. There is a world before the division of speech and a world after. And the world after is the world we live in, more fragmented, more lonely in some essential way, more separated from one another by the simple, brutal fact that your words are not my words. A language is a border you carry in your mouth, and both traditions are saying there was a time before that border existed. Now, let's go even further. Because the Sumerian and Hebrew texts are not the only ancient sources that brush against this idea. In ancient Egyptian theology, speech is treated like a creative force. Some texts praise Ptah as the mind and mouth that speaks the world into order, not as a science claim, as an image, a way of saying reality responds to words. In Vedic traditions from ancient India, Vak, sacred speech, appears as a living power, not merely communication, but a force that binds a cosmos together. And in Greek thought, long before modern linguistics, there is logos, not a mythic monster, a principle, an ordering word, a way of naming the feeling that the universe is intelligible, that meaning can exist. Across enormously different cultures, ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, Greece, the Hebrew world, there is a recurring idea. Speech, at its origin, was one, and something, divine will, human pride, the passage of time, made it many. Now, you might be asking, is that just a human wish? Now, you might be asking, is that just a human wish? A nostalgia, a dream of unity in a world that never had it? Maybe. But listen to the pattern. These are not stories saying, once we were happy. They are stories saying, once we were coordinated. Once the signal was clean. Once the message moved without distortion. And the moment you live in a multi-tongued world, you learn something unsettling. A truth can die in translation. A joke can become an insult. A promise can become a threat. So the translator becomes powerful. The interpreter becomes feared. Because whoever controls meaning controls the room. And in that light, one language stops being a fantasy. It becomes an ancient memory of what it feels like when no one can twist your words. Do we simply want to believe in a lost original unity? A time before the confusion? Maybe. But here is where the historical lens enters. Because when you step back from the texts, when you look at what we actually know about how languages work, how they move, how they split, how they drift, something extraordinary emerges. Not a divine confounding, something more patient, and in its own way, more mysterious. A language is a border you carry in your mouth, and the story of how those borders were drawn is the story of everything that happened next. Picture a caravan leaving the great river city. 40 people, donkeys loaded with grain and copper and lapis lazuli, heading north. They speak the language of the city, every word precise, every phrase shared. When the caravan master says water, everyone reaches for the same kind of vessel. Now, imagine that caravan settles, somewhere to the north, a valley, good soil. They build a village, they have children, and those children grow up, not in the city, but here, in the valley, with the sounds of a different wind, different animals, different neighbors. Generations pass, 100 years, 200. The city they came from sends no messengers, no traders, no shared festivals. And here is the thing about language. It is alive. It breathes. It changes every single generation. Not dramatically, just a little. It changes every single generation. Not dramatically, just a little. A child invents a shortcut word for a tool her parents never had. The village laughs. Then the village repeats it. And a year later, everyone forgets it was invented. A border guard hears a foreign name and writes it wrong on a tax tablet. The wrong spelling becomes official, and the next generation grows up believing it was always that way. A soldier learns 3 command words in a language he doesn't love. Forward, stop, bring water. He carries those words home like loot. He says them to his children without thinking. How many empires were built from borrowed syllables? A vowel shifts. A word for a new tool gets invented. An old word gets used for something new. A borrowed word comes in from the neighboring tribe, and it sticks. 200 years later, a traveler from the original city arrives at the valley settlement. He speaks to the people there, and something is wrong. He can almost understand them, almost. But some words have drifted so far, he has to stop and ask. And they look at him with polite confusion, as if he is speaking an older, stranger version of something they know. This is not magic. This is not punishment. This is language doing what language always does. It is a living thing, and living things change. Linguists call this process divergence, when a single language splits into daughter languages over time. We see it everywhere. Latin, one language spoken across the Roman Empire. Now, Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian, distinct enough that a Spaniard and a Romanian cannot easily converse. Same ancestor, centuries of separation. But here is where it gets interesting, because it isn't just time that splits languages. It is also power. When one empire conquers another, something happens to both languages. The conqueror's language spreads, but it absorbs. It picks up words from the conquered. It changes. And the conquered language, it doesn't always die. Sometimes it goes underground. It becomes the language of the home, the language of whispers, the language of the market when the soldiers aren't listening. Sometimes it goes underground. It becomes the language of the home, the language of whispers, the language of the market when the soldiers aren't listening. A mother teaches her child 2 sets of words, one for the street, one for the kitchen, one that keeps you safe in public, one that keeps you yourself in private. And the child learns something adults rarely admit out loud. A language can be a disguise. A language can be a hiding place. So when an ancient story speaks of confounding, ask another question. Could confounding also mean being forced to choose which voice you are allowed to use? Think about the ancient Near East. Sumerian, the first written language we have. Then Akkadian came, and for centuries both existed side by side. Sumerian became the language of priests, of sacred texts, of ceremony. like Latin in medieval Europe, a language no one spoke at home, but everyone used to address the divine. Then Babylonian, then Aramaic, which spread so widely that under later empires, it became one of the common tongues of administration and trade across much of the ancient Near East. A common tongue for trade, not because anyone voted on it, because it was useful, because it traveled. Imagine two scribes, one from the river cities, one from the highland border. They sit in the same room, both loyal to the same empire, and they still cannot fully understand each other's native speech. So they reach for the shared code, the language that gets paperwork done, the language that keeps you alive when the governor is impatient. A letter is dictated. The scribe chooses words that will not be misheard. He avoids poetry. He avoids local slang. He writes for clarity. And in that choice, a new standard is born. How many dialects died quietly, not by violence, but by paperwork? And every time two groups exchanged, they exchanged language. And every time two groups exchanged, they exchanged language. Now picture a border town, somewhere between two empires. A place where Aramaic-speaking merchants meet Akkadian-speaking officials, and both of them occasionally need to talk to a Greek-speaking sailor who came up the river. What do? You invent a pidgin, a blended half-language, just enough shared words to trade, just enough common sounds to negotiate. And if that pidgin gets stable, if it's used by a community long enough, the children who grow up hearing it make it their mother tongue. They refine it, they expand it. A new language is born. Not from confusion, from contact. A new language is born. Not from confusion, from contact. And contact is not gentle. Sometimes it is trade. Sometimes it is marriage. Sometimes it is conquest. A young woman from one valley marries into another. She brings her childhood words with her. She teaches them to a baby. The baby grows up speaking a blended home language, a private dialect stitched together from love and necessity. Is that not, in miniature, Babel? A tower built out of two tongues inside one mouth? Estimates vary, but many linguists agree on the direction of the trend. In the modern world, languages are disappearing faster than they are born. Every generation, some tongues fall silent, not because human beings stop speaking, but because schooling, power, and trade reward a few large languages. Which means this: if you go back far enough into the ancient world, you do not find neat uniformity. You find a crowded chorus, many tongues pressed close together, and contact, constant contact, reshaping them. And if that is true, then the Babel question changes shape, because the mystery is no longer, why do we have so many languages? The mystery becomes, why do ancient stories remember the split as sudden? Why does a slow process get told like a single night? Here is where history meets the ancient story in a way that catches your breath. Linguists have identified a theoretical proto-language, or a family of proto-languages, from which enormous numbers of modern languages descend. One of them is called Proto-Indo-European, a language often estimated to have been spoken many millennia ago. We have no written record of it, not a single inscription. It was reconstructed, painstakingly, by comparing the daughter languages: Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Old Persian, Old English, Old Irish, comparing their structures, their roots, their grammar, finding the echoes, and from those echoes, building backward to a ghost language. To a ghost language. Imagine the scene: a quiet room, a desk, a scholar in lamplight, comparing word roots like fingerprints, not to win an argument, to listen for a voice that left no recording. And here is the unsettling thought: if a language can vanish so completely, what else can vanish? Cities, peoples, whole worlds. A tongue no one alive has ever heard. The scholars who do this work are doing something astonishing. They are listening for the sound of a language that vanished before writing existed. They are, in a strange sense, trying to reverse the confounding. A language is a border you carry in your mouth, and the linguists are trying to find what the land looked like before the border was drawn. But here is the question that none of this fully answers. Here is the thing that brings us back to the ancient text, and the ancient text back to the science. If languages diverge slowly, over centuries, over migrations, why do the oldest traditions describe the change as sudden, as something that happened in a moment, as a morning to evening transformation, not a generational drift? Is it just the way myths compress time? Is it a memory of something real, dramatized into a divine act? Or is there something else entirely going on? The answer, or the closest thing we have to one, is waiting in the final chapter, and it is stranger than either the myth or the science alone. Let's think about what we know. We know that languages change, slowly, silently, without anyone noticing. One vowel per generation, one borrowed word per decade. We know that Mesopotamia, the region the ancient text calls Shinar, was a place where multiple peoples, multiple tongues, multiple scripts already coexisted. The tower was not built by a monolingual people. It was built by a civilization that was already multilingual at its edges and trying to maintain unity at its center. We know that Babylon, the city that becomes Babel, was a real place with a real tower that was really never quite finished. We know that an ancient Sumerian text from the very same culture, from the very same geographic moment, also describes a primordial unity of speech and its loss. And we know that linguists, working backward through thousands of languages, believe that the further back you go, the fewer the sources, the closer you get to something like unity, a smaller number of original tongues. Maybe, in the deepest past we can imagine, something that felt from the inside like one. Now, here is the twist. Most people approach this story as a question of truth. Did it happen? Was there a literal moment of divine confounding? Or was it a slow, natural process? But the ancient storyteller, whoever first assembled these words into the Genesis account, may not have been asking that question. The ancient storyteller was asking a different question entirely. Why do we not understand each other? Why do people who live in the same city, who share the same sky, who eat the same bread, sometimes look at each other across a table and feel utterly foreign? Not just because of different words, but because of different meanings behind the same words, different intentions dressed in identical language. The Tower of Babel may not be a story about a single event. It may be a story about a permanent condition, because the confusion it describes, that sudden, bewildering fracture between what you mean and what is heard, that happens every day, between nations, between neighbors, between people who have been married for 30 years and one morning realize they have been speaking different languages for decades. A language is a border you carry in your mouth, and sometimes that border runs right through the middle of a conversation. The ancient story gives this fracture a name. It gives it a cause. It says, "This is not an accident. This is not just time passing and words drifting. This is something that happens when human ambition forgets its own limits, when we build so high and so fast, when we coordinate our power so completely toward one single tower that we lose something equally important: the humility to understand that we are not all the same, that the person standing next to you, even when they use your words, may mean something entirely different." This is what scholars sometimes call the cultural function of the myth. Not history, not science, but meaning. A story that explains not just a past event, but a present experience. And here is where the history and the myth reach the same place from different directions. The historical lens tells us languages split because people moved. People moved because of ambition, because of empire building, because of hunger and war and trade and curiosity, the same drives that build towers. The ancient text says, language was confounded because of a tower, and the history says, towers, empires, scatter peoples. Scattering peoples splits languages. Different explanation, same architecture. And somewhere underneath both, underneath the myth and the migration and the linguist's reconstructed ghost language, there is a question that neither fully resolves. Was there ever a moment when all human beings could understand each other? Not just in words, but fully. Was there ever a time before the border, before the wall of sound that rises between one mind and another? The ancient traditions say, yes, there was a morning when that was true. And the linguists say, possibly. Go back far enough, and the branches trace back to fewer and fewer trunks. And many researchers suggest the human capacity for language likely emerged once, or at least far fewer times than the number of languages we now speak. Not many times. Once. Which means, somewhere in our deep history, there was, in some sense, a first word, spoken by the first human mouth to form one. And from that first word, everything else branched outward. A language is a border you carry in your mouth, but borders weren't always there, and the memory of the time before them keeps surfacing. In ancient Sumerian clay tablets, in the Hebrew scriptures, in the human longing to be completely understood. The tower was never finished. In Babylon, and perhaps in every civilization since, we keep building, we keep reaching, we keep trying to coordinate our voices into one great ascending thing. And something, history, pride, fear, the nature of power, the nature of meaning, keeps scattering us, keeps multiplying the tongues, keeps drawing new borders. And yet, you are listening to these words right now, words assembled in one language, reaching you wherever you are, in whatever room, whatever country, whatever silence surrounds you tonight. Maybe that is the unfinished tower still rising, one word at a time. One voice carried across the distance, still trying to be understood. Before the silence returns, this story asks you something, not as a formality, as a real question. When you think about the Tower of Babel, which version unsettles you more? The divine confounding, the sudden fracture of something perfect, or the historical version, the slow, quiet, inevitable drift of peoples away from each other, word by word, generation by generation? Leave your answer below, because these stories only deepen when more voices enter them. And if you want the next ancient mystery, the next story that history almost forgot, tell me which one to open next. Listen closely to your own answer.